right, thank you so much. Thank you for the intro, and thank you to stackconf for having me. I just want to get this out there. This is my first time speaking at like a proper, legitimate conference, so I'm pretty excited about that. But this is not my first time speaking about accessibility. Pretty much over the 15 years as a senior front-end developer, I've kind of grown this passion for creating web accessible products and advocating for doing that. So today I want to go through the keys to an accessibility mindset and find ways that we can make accessible choices at the earliest stages of our design and development. So at first, we're going to find out how we all relate to accessibility and how we all benefit from it, whether we're really aware of it or not. And then we're going to quickly address the 4 core principles of accessibility, and then we're going to see how we can apply those principles into our keys to an accessibility mindset. So first, relating to accessibility. The key point here is that accessible design is good design. Quick question, who here crossed the street to get here today? Okay, so you probably had crosswalks, right? I think crosswalks are one of the best examples of accessible design, because a lot of us might be able just to look both ways and cross whenever we're ready. But we have the icons, we have colors, and we have sound indicators to know when we can cross. So while those choices might have been made for people who have low vision, hard of hearing, people who may not be able to cross the street as safely as others, we all benefit from those. So if we think of a parent who's teaching their child how to cross the street safely, they're not going to necessarily tell them, look both ways and then cross. They're going to say, wait until the icon is green. Wait until you have this audible cue where you have a different sound that says it's now safe to cross. Or if you're moving, you're carrying big packages, something like that, you might not want to run across the street yourself. You're going to wait for the crosswalk to change and turn green as well so you can cross safely. So while these decisions might have been made to benefit people who need accessible choices like this, we can all benefit from them in the same way. Another way I like to compare accessible design is to responsive design. Responsive design is a standard. Pretty much anytime you're creating a new product, a new website, anything, it needs to be responsive. Yet we'll find that accessible design has the same work and the same benefits as responsive design. Doing both responsive and accessible products requires cross-team collaboration. You need design, you need PMs, you need QA, you need dev, you need everyone invested to create a responsive product, just the same way you need everyone invested to create an accessible product. The work for responsive design is never done. For as long as you're editing code, building new features, you need to make sure that those features are responsive. Accessible design is the exact same way. For as long as you're editing code, building new features, adding new pages, you need to make sure that that functionality is accessible. Responsive design benefits an ever-expanding audience. Every day, there's a new iPhone 15 that was out, and we have new tablets, new phones all the time. And if you have a responsive website, you're able to accommodate all these expanding device options. And again, accessibility is the same way. There's multiple screen readers, different hardware systems, different OSs, different versions. So if you build an accessible product, you can support an ever-expanding range of people who need that. Both responsive design and accessible design benefit and directly impact sales and conversions. If you've ever gone to check out on a website, but you can't check out on your phone, there's a chance you close the tab and you said, I'll get to it on my laptop, and then you never get to it. When someone's trying to do the same thing with, say, a screen reader on their phone or on their laptop, they would have that same experience. So if they're able to check out using a screen reader, they'll be able to convert. If they can't, they might leave the experience. And lastly, there's an expectation. If you view a website on your phone, you have an expectation that it will work. I think restaurant menus is a key example of this. So many restaurants have horrible sites because you can't easily see the menu on your phone. So again, I'm using the website on my phone. I expect it to work. If I'm using a website even on my phone using TalkBack, a screen reader on Android, or if I'm on my laptop using VoiceOver on Mac, I have an expectation that what I need to do can be done in my situation. So as you see, responsive design and accessible design, kind of one and the same. However, products really only care about responsive design. It's almost implied that, of course, we're going to make this website responsive. Of course, this product is going to work on mobile. but we don't actually see the same value and the same work and the same benefits in accessible design. And I sort of, with responsive design being implied like that, I want accessibility to be the same way. I want it that way. So tell me why. Why is accessible design not held to the same regard, to the same respect, the same standard as responsive design? And I think that comes down to one key point, and that's that web accessibility is fundamentally misunderstood. I think this graphic here from Microsoft's Inclusive Design course is a great representation of this. In my experience, I've been talking to managers and PMs about needing to advocating for making accessible choices in our products. And in my experience, I've seen that pretty much we really only pay attention to this permanent column. We only associate accessibility with someone who is permanently disabled, someone who might be neurodivergent, someone who might be missing a limb, someone who might be legally blind. And we kind of lose sight that there's many variations to people who might identify as disabled. And as we've seen with crosswalks, making accessible choices benefits everybody, whether they require them or not. But making a product that is not accessible completely disables a person from being able to have that experience, to be able to use your product. Accessibility is not taking away from anything. It's not taking away from anyone. But the opposite is true. If we don't make accessible products, we are taking away from people. Put that another way, an estimated 1 in 6 people in the world experience a significant disability. That's a pretty large amount of people, and that's mostly just considering the permanent column. And that's not considering people who may temporarily be disabled, people who may situationally be disabled. So with such a massive audience, with such a huge impact that we can make with accessible choices, I want us to go over how we can actually do that. So first, we're going to address and learn about the core principles of accessibility. So first, we have P for perceivable. This is a phrase I'm probably going to use a lot today, and that's communicating in layers. If you think about watching Netflix, you have the video and the audio. But if you're like me and you're struggling to learn Finnish, you're watching it with Finnish subtitles. And you don't learn it, but they're there. And you can try to pick up words as you go. Or in my wife's case, we'll watch it with English subtitles so she can pick up some accents, right? So Netflix in that way is communicating in layers. We have the audio of the actual show, and then we have the subtitles for the script. We're communicating the same information, the same message in layers. And in that way, we're creating perceivable content. It can be consumed in multiple ways. Then we have O for operable. And this pretty much just boils down to if you can do it with a mouse, you can do it with a keyboard. So there's lots of fancy select menus, drop-down menus, buttons, interactions, stuff like that, window resizes that we think we can do with our mouse and everything's fine, until you try and have the same interaction with your keyboard, and you realize you can't do the same thing. And the key point to making sure that your content is operable is making sure that you do not require a mouse to operate it. You have to be able to operate it in multiple ways. Then we have U for understandable. This is making sure that we're using language that our audience understands. This is making sure that we have a layout that's consistent. You don't move navigations around. We don't randomly pop up full screen overlays that kind of break the entire layout and the usability of it. We want the experience to be consistent and familiar, because if it is, we're able to navigate and we're able to find the things we need in an easy way. So we want to create an understandable experience. And lastly, we have R for robust. This was maybe a little ambiguous, but this mostly boils down to you want to make sure that your rendered HTML, what actually gets rendered and sent to the client, you want to make sure that that is standards compliant. The same way that we want to make sure that we're using features that have wide browser support, whether it's a new JS method, a new CSS feature, we're checking something like can I use to see if the browsers that we need to support actually support that feature. And robust here is kind of the same thing. We want to make sure that we're creating an experience that is broadly supported. So a lot of this boils down to making sure that we're shipping and rendering semantic and standards compliant HTML. So we have perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. These are the 4 principles of accessibility. So now we want to learn how can we apply these to our keys to an accessibility mindset so we can understand how we can make decisions at the earliest stages of design and development that have a positive impact on the people using our products. So the first key we're going to get into is that markup is functional, not visual. And one of the key examples I want to go through here is the classic back button. Even in language, we refer to it as a back button. But in functional terms, what it's doing is it's navigating you to the previous page. That's more of a function of a link or an anchor tag, not an actual button. So even though our design may visually make it look like a button, we have to write our markup relative to how that element functions. So we're going to take a look at a demo here, and if the Wi-Fi complies, if not, I have a fallback. All right, it works. We'll go full page. All right, so we have 3 examples here. We have the same back button as an anchor tag. We have it as a button, and we have it as the lowly div. So with this first example, we're going to hover over it, and we can see in the bottom left corner here, we have a little preview of the link that we're going to actually visit. And this is when we're using the anchor tag. When we right-click on it, we get all the options like open the link in the new tab, new window, copy the link address, save the link it has. We get all of this link-specific functionality when we're using a link-specific tag. And then another benefit of this is, oh man, we can use our keyboard to tab to and navigate to this anchor tag. So when we're writing our markup relative to the function of the element, we get all of that function-specific context. Now we'll come over here to the button. We can hover it, fine, but we don't get the URL preview. If we right-click, we don't get the link-specific context that we would expect from a link. If you're like me, a lot of times when you're navigating, you're holding Command whenever you're clicking a link to just open everything in a new tab. If you do that on a button, you can't do that because it doesn't function, it doesn't act as an actual link. You can't do that with button navigation. So yes, you can tab to it, that's fine, but you're not getting the same experience. So if I'm a screen reader user, I'm going to expect this to tell me that this is a link. I'm expecting this to tell me that this will navigate me to another page. If it's a back button, I need to just kind of assume I know what that's doing. And then lastly, we have this div. We can hover it. You can add on-click events. You can make it navigate whatever. Just don't. This is bad for everybody. You can't tab to it. It gives you no context. And you're essentially having to recreate all the functionality that's native in the browser if you would just use an anchor tag. So we will close this. So with that, we're going through the demo that markup is going to be functional, not visual. That's kind of tough sometimes. Because in our second example here, we're going to look at progress bars, a very common element. And while in HTML we have a native progress element, one thing we really can't do with it is the radial progress bars. So we end up doing like div solutions or SVG solutions, some other alternative that breaks the semantic markup and the semantic meaning of actually using the progress element in HTML. So in the instance where you cannot write functional markup and have it achieve the design style that you are required to do, you want to write perceivable markup. And this is where you want to communicate again in layers. So in this demo, we're going to look at the radial progress bars. And visually, we're communicating the message that we're 50% complete or 25% complete. But we want to make sure that we're using, in this case, ARIA attributes and ARIA markup to communicate that same visual message with our markup. So this is going to be a video that we're going to try. Can I get the mic? And it's going to, thank you so much. What this is going to do is it's going to show us how a screen reader, in this case VoiceOver on Mac, interprets the different iterations of these progress bars. And you can kind of hear how these markup decisions have an impact on the end users. So let's get this going. And we're going to try, is this on? Yes, it is. So I'm just going to try and not get any feedback on the mic here, and we'll give this a listen.
Heading level 3, without perceivable markup. 25%. 25%. Heading level 3, with perceivable markup. Current level 50% progress indicator. Current level 50% progress indicator. Heading level 3, with functional markup. Current level 75% progress indicator.
Could everybody hear that? Awesome. All right, I'll have one more. Yes, one more, yeah. Yeah, so, cool. What we heard in that demo was in the first iteration here, where we're not using perceivable markup, we're just using divs, we're only communicating 25%, 25%. Now, visually, I might be able to look at that progress bar and understand contextually what that means. But if someone's using a screen reader, if someone's using screen magnification and they're zoomed in on a part of their site, on a part of the page that is not that progress bar, what does 25% mean? And that's where the perceivable markup comes into play. We want to give context to the values, the same context that our visual design is communicating. We want to make sure that our markup is giving that same context. So in the second demo here with perceivable markup, we're using ARIA attributes to say, hey, 50% current level progress indicator. It gives context to the value, so even if you're not aware of visually what's around that value, you can understand what the context of that means. And then in the last example, we have the functional markup using the native progress element, and you can hear that it's very comparable to the actual perceivable markup example. So if you can't write functional markup, there we go. If you can't write functional markup to achieve the visual effects that you need, you want to make sure you use perceivable markup and communicate that same information in layers so that you give context to the design. Second key we want to look at is that markup must communicate as clearly as the design. And we saw in the last example, we could do this by using ARIA attributes and perceivable markup. But in this example, we're going to take a look at a common navigation bar pattern. Normal pattern would be whenever you're on an active page, that nav link in the bar has like a different background color, sometimes underline, whatever. We differentiate it visually. And again, someone might be using a screen reader. Someone might be having a screen magnification software zoom in on a part of the page. That is not the navigation. So we want to make sure that our markup communicates just as clearly as our design. So we're going to look at another video here to demonstrate that point.
Link.
So I'll start this over. All right.
Home. Link.
Nope. Here we go.
Link. Home. Link. Products. Link. Home. Current page link. Products.
So yeah, in that example, I don't want to dig into the specific code or anything, but we're using one ARIA attribute called ARIA current, and we're designating that as the ARIA current page. So what we're doing here is we're making sure that our visual design of products being the active page in the navigation, we're using our HTML and we're using our markup to communicate that same message, to make sure that we're creating a perceivable experience. People can understand where we're at on the page, both visually and with our markup. So we want to make sure that we're writing markup that communicates just as clearly as our design. But it gets kind of complicated. Well, how do you know when, where to do that? We don't need luck, as the great Michael Scott likes to say. So I put together a few groups of when you might know perceivable markup would be beneficial. And the first group here is when design visually communicates state. We just saw this with the active page and the navigation. We can see this with active tabs, loading states, disabled states. I mean, we all see the loading spinner is synonymous with just waiting and just buffering. But how often are we communicating that in any other way than just the visual SVG spinning? We need to communicate in layers. So when we're visually communicating state with the design, we want to make sure that our markup is communicating the same message. Second group would be when information falls outside of the standard flow of content. You can see this normally with toast messages or error messages that pop up, dialogues, modals, tooltips, anything like that. When content pops up and is displayed outside of the normal flow of content, that's going to be another indicator that, hey, I might need to associate this button with this modal or this button or this trigger with the content that it controls. Third group is when content is dynamic or live. At Noise, I work on a whole lot of live data, a lot of chats, a lot of request messages, other things that are happening. And we need to make sure that whenever you get like a friend notification in the top bar and it just is that little bubble with a 1, if you can't see that, what does it mean, right? So if you're having this live data that updates on the page without refreshing, you want to make sure that you're communicating that as well with your markup, with generally ARIA live regions, to indicate that, hey, this data over here has changed, and it can draw your attention to that. So when content is dynamic or live, that's going to be another indicator that your markup may need to communicate like your design. And the last group here is when we're recreating standard elements. We saw this with the progress bar. We can use a standard progress element to create that horizontal effect. We can design it, we can animate it, do all those things. But once we need to make it a radial bar, it gets a little complicated. So whenever you need to recreate that standard element, the progress is a standard element, that's going to be another indicator that you need to write markup that communicates that role, that communicates those values, that communicates the function and context of that element that you're recreating. So that is how to know when content may need perceivable markup. And that brings us to our final key for today, and that is going to be that use more than color to indicate state. We often see this with tabs, and I was kind of struggling to come up with an example for this, but luckily I had a flight on KLM, and they made me confused. This was the screen on the back of the chair, and I couldn't tell which measurement was active, imperial or metric. Was it imperial because it's the same color as everything else? Was it metric because it was a different color than everything else? I had to look at altitude. You know how long that took me? Seconds. Finally, I realized it was meters. Metric selected. Terrific. I couldn't tell. Basic design principle in the classic book is don't make me think. In like 8-hour flight, I spent 1 second deciding if this was, or figuring out if this was metrics or imperial. It's not how I wanted to spend my time. And that's because we're using only color to indicate the state. I'm not a designer. Designers are far more creative than I am. Here, all I added an underline and increased the font weight. We're using very subtle differences here to communicate the same information in multiple ways. Maybe we have like a little arrow cut out. Maybe we have something fancy around it. I don't know. Designers are terrific at that stuff. I'm not so much. But here, we're at least doing a few differences. And to my eye, I can more clearly see that metric is active in the second screenshot, much more clearly than the first one. So the point here is we want to make sure that we use more than just color to indicate our state. And with that, we have our 3 keys to an accessibility mindset. 3 ways that we can make decisions at the start of our design and development processes that have positive impacts on the people using our products. But I threw a bunch of stuff at you. We're just going to do a quick recap. We have the 4 principles of accessibility. We have perceivable, making sure that we communicate in layers. We have operable, making sure that you don't need a mouse to do it. Understandable, making sure we have a consistent experience on the web. And robust, making sure that we're shipping and delivering standards-compliant markup that can be supported by a wide variety of devices. Then we have our individual keys. Markup is functional, not visual. We want to write our markup relative to how the element functions, not how it looks. Again, designers are super creative. They make things look amazing and beautiful. Got to look through that facade. What does the element do? And that's how we want to write our markup. Then we have that markup must communicate as clearly as our design. Again, if we're using just design to indicate a state, to indicate a value, to communicate a message, and that's only done visually, we want to make sure that we have that layer of perceivable markup to make sure that our markup communicates just as clearly as our design does. And lastly, we want to use more than just color to indicate state, because time is money, and I spent a second figuring out if it was metrics or imperial. If we use multiple ways to indicate our message, we can make sure that it's more clearly understood more quickly. And with that, I want to say thank you all for attending. Thank you, stackconf, for having me. And I think we got a few minutes for questions. I'm happy to hear. What do you have?
Thank you very much for this great talk. Are there any questions from the audience, please? I have this fancy catch box.
Are you letting me off the hook with no questions?
Do you get positive feedback from... you get one. All right. Then. Catch.
Hey.
Hey.
When designing internal tools within your company, do you actively strive to add this additional rich text into your design? if there's no obvious ask from your management or from anyone within your firm to implement this, do you also go through the process of trying to set this up as well?
So in an ideal world, it would be a top-down. Everyone would be invested from management on down on making these decisions. The case that I hear a lot is we're building internal tools. No one in our company is disabled. All right, so you're just never going to hire a disabled person. No one after years of staring at their computer are going to have bad vision, right? No one after using a mouse is going to get a little carpal tunnel, get a little sore, right? So it doesn't matter what you have right now. And ideally, management would be on board with that. In my experience, more often than not, they're not. So these are decisions that you can advocate for on your own. So in my current position, I've kind of upskilled our other front-end developers to learn these patterns. We've implemented different linters, stuff like that, to kind of force good behavior. And we've collaborated pretty closely with the design team as well. So we're kind of taking it on ourselves to push this forward a little bit. Hopefully management comes on board, but because without the full buy-in, you can't really get the full support because you need everyone from management to QA and everything in between, but you can still advocate and push this forward on your own as well. Yep. We got one in the corner.
Yeah, this is generally, do you have a standard that you develop accessibility to?
So I mostly follow the AA compliance. So there are 3 levels of accessibility compliance. You have single A, which is the lowest, double, and then triple A, which is the highest. Double A is the most kind of achievable. Triple A is pretty strict. So for an example, there is the European Accessibility Act that goes into effect June 28th, 2025. I remember that because it's my birthday. So that will actually force like public sector products and pages to meet the AA compliancy. So it's a pretty standard, like if you meet AA, you're usually pretty good. AAA is usually pretty difficult to reach.
Thank you. And
Yep.
as a follow-on, are there any like integration or unit tests that you have to like test against those?
So there is, when it's from like DEC University, they have a CI integration tool that can run against any PRs or anything that goes into main. This will catch maybe 30-ish% because it tests very objective things. Does this image have an alt text? Does this button have a label? So very quantifiable things. What it doesn't test for is, can you use this autocomplete select field without a mouse and stuff like that. So it can catch a lot of the low-hanging fruit very well, but it won't, that's not your catch-all. That's not going to be the saving grace for everything. Yep. I will add, I do think AI will change that. Because if we think about screen readers, they're quite primitive in how they even interpret content. So if you're writing standards compliant HTML that VoiceOver and JAWS and TalkBack can interpret, if those simple devices and tools can interpret your markup, AI is going to be able to do a whole lot more with it. So that's just my forethought on that.
Thank you very much again.
Absolutely.
If there are no further questions, otherwise Daniel is around and will be open for questions anytime, I guess.
Absolutely. If you see me, come say something.
Thank you very much again.
Thank you all.